So, like everyone else since it initially launched last year, albeit everyone else not so much lately, I've been very busy getting hands-on with New World, at least within the limited amount of free time I possess on most given days. While I haven't yet completely maxed out my character stats or reached the max cap of level 60s, I'm in the 50s. I've gotten to a point where I feel I can give an honest and fairly informed opinion on my experience within the game. I put in too much time into New World for this to just be a first impressions video, but as I've not yet played through the endgame content, assuming there is any, it's hard to call this a complete review of everything that's in the MMO. That said, if the endgame stuff, assuming it exists, is anything like the rest of the game so far, it probably won't do much to overall influence my opinion of the game. I think it would be the understatement of the year to say that there was a certain amount of pressure on Amazon Studios to deliver in every way possible with New World. Amazon's short-lived history as a game developer and publisher is questionable at best, or a downright industry-wide joke at worst, depending on how you look at it. While Amazon has in total announced and developed half a dozen or so AAA games over the past several years, only 2 of them ever proved to be even remotely commercially viable, with one being a licensed tie-in game and the other now being New World. The only prior time Amazon Studios really made a name for itself outside of its obvious connection to its parent company was when they rolled out the infamously laughable, abysmal online multiplayer game, Crucible, a game I also reviewed when it came out. Of course, this ended up being one of the most embarrassing AAA gaming disasters of 2020, and Amazon quickly shelved the project, hoping it would maybe be reworked and relaunched at a later date. Of course, this never actually happened, and most of the development team ultimately got switched over to work on New World, which around this time was experiencing its own developmental difficulties. New World was originally branded as this almost exclusively PvP clan versus clan gameplay format, where everything was designed with a communal, collaborative, but also competitive experience firmly in mind. And for clarification, when I say competitive, I'm not talking about esports. Amazon wanted to build a game that strongly incentivized and rewarded clear communication and combined teamwork in groups consisting of a number of different loadouts and fighting styles. I'm careful to not explicitly refer to character classes because, unlike most similar MMORPGs, New World at release and in the lead up to release made it clear that traditional character classes and role functions would not be implemented, something I personally really appreciated. Instead, players could utilize any of the readily available weapon types in the game and rotate between those weapons at any point, should they choose to. Each weapon has its own unique skill tree with a variety of both active skills and passive buffs available for players to unlock. Personally, I found myself sticking with the one-handed rapier and the musket as my 2 go-to options, but I later ended up swapping to the hammer, which I'll get to later. Having a combination of one close-ranged weapon and one medium to long-range weapon is the most ideal loadout for this game, and I can't recommend playing in any other way. The way combat here in New World generally operates in most instances is when you start shooting at an enemy at range or otherwise dealing your at-range damage while the enemy in question runs at you, and once they get close you pull out your melee weapon and alternate between striking them and blocking their attacks in turn. The combat system is definitely one of the weaker elements of the game, which is a major problem as combat in MMOs is one of, if not the most important elements. All of the heavy attacks are more or less worthless given the wind-up time and the damage dealt, compared with the damage that could instead be dealt within that same time window by just using the normal primary light attack. Each weapon only has a meager handful of cooldown abilities, all of which are on lengthy cooldowns that prevent you from being able to fire them off in rapid succession. While you can alternate between weapons, as weapons no longer utilize a shared universal cooldown system, something that was originally planned by the developers, there is still far too much emphasis placed on only using the main light and heavy forms of attack, which completely goes against the concept of allowing players to freely play the game their own way, and likewise is contrary to what most other similar MMORPGs have done, where the use of such abilities is far more commonplace. Likewise, another area in which New World deviates somewhat from the norm, a theme I promise we'll be revisiting a lot of times throughout this review, is how enemies and quests are dispersed throughout the world. Generally in MMORPGs, one of the main reasons you'd want players to have ready access to a number of skills and passive buffs is because at times players will need to be able to fight fairly large groups of normal enemies, small pockets of more powerful elite enemies, or hell, even bosses, either by themselves or in a small group supported by smaller enemies. The best MMORPGs find a middle ground between the two approaches by creating distinct character classes or playstyles with deep and meaningful differences that work well well in conjunction with one another to create a shared collective synergy in groups of players. At best, New World fulfills the secondary requirement adequately, but as for the former, you spend almost your entire time in open world only fighting a handful of enemies at a time, with fights almost always being decided purely by who can spam attacks faster, either you or the group of enemies you're fighting. For a game that has openly bragged about rewarding skillful play, the way they've designed enemy engagement doesn't seem to really reflect that, as it never really creates these opportunities for such skill to shine. Instead, similar to games like Assassin's Creed or Arkham Asylum, it's just a constant contest between attack and block until one of the enemies starts glowing, at which point you have to dodge their attack and attack them when they stumble or charge past you. It's worth noting that the detection radius for enemies seems to vary at wildly inconsistent rates. Enemies seem to be able to spot you in front of them at an almost ridiculous rate, but if you're sprinting full speed past them from behind, they'll ignore you completely in almost all instances. Also, there seems to be this weird feature where if a group of enemies are close together and one of them spots you, the rest run over. Well, that isn't weird, but what's weird is not all the enemies will actually run over. If there's 5 or 6 enemies all in a close clump, maybe 2 or 3 will run over to you. The AI seems designed in a way where, no matter how many enemies are close to them, only 2 or 3 of their fellows will be tasked with helping the first enemy kill you. I assume this is to make combat not overly difficult for players, but it is kind of stupid. Also, hit registration seems to be a fairly consistent issue, as well as these weird animation canceling glitches, which you may notice at varying points throughout this video. I'm happy to report that the amount of enemy variety when it comes to your typical normal and elite type enemies is quite extensive, with different types of enemies available for the player to engage with throughout the world. The world itself is broken up with each individual territory aimed at players within a certain level range, ranging from levels 1 to 25, levels 25 to 50, and levels 50 to 60. In hindsight, I feel like they probably could have benefited from splitting it up one more time, like maybe do 1 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 50, and 50 to 60, just because once you get to the higher end of whatever tier you're in, it can get really difficult to find enemies similar to your current level, leaving you feeling like you're wasting your time during those last few hours in that area. Probably one of my least favorite PvE aspects to New World is one that I'm sure many other content creators would disagree with me on, and that is New World's approach to PvE raids, being labeled in-game as expeditions. Put simply, these expeditions are just unbelievably boring, and borders on being an outright waste of time for pretty much anyone under the max player level cap of 60. The dungeons themselves tend to be fairly generic looking from a visual design perspective. The enemies are almost always the exact same enemies you fight in the surface level, and the loot rewards, at least in the half dozen or so expeditions I committed to before giving up on the mode altogether, were pitiful at best. Similar to most MMORPGs, players can upgrade their gear mainly by acquiring said gear in the form of either rewards for completing certain story missions and optional side missions, and also by opening chests in either the open world or unscripted expeditions. Expeditions, at least in theory, yield higher value loot, but that's not been my experience. Normally I would have gladly spent far more time playing through these expeditions, but irritatingly enough, the game inexplicably bars any form of cross-server regional matchmaking. The only way to actually play these expeditions is by personally inviting other players on the same server to join your group. If you, like me, don't want to constantly be dealing with the hassle of wrangling another 4 or 5 players to join you while also ensuring you or at least one other person on your team has the required resources in order to initiate the expedition, then you're more or less going to find yourself completely barred from ever accessing what's probably supposedly the most interesting mode in the game. I would disagree with that claim, but again, most people seem to like it, so take that as you will. And for the record, yes, I said most interesting, not most unique. Plenty of MMORPG games have dungeons, it's basically a genre requirement, but I did, at least in part, enjoy my time in expeditions. I'm just really disappointed that the game so heavily limits the number of times you can grind these dungeons. One almost has to wonder what was the point in even creating these playable dungeons if you're going to place so many restrictions on how and when they can be accessed. If the issue is you don't want players to take advantage of dungeons to just farm high-value loot endlessly, then put a few safeguards in place to gradually decrease the odds of high-value loot spawning in from fallen enemies and treasure chests in these dungeons. I haven't really played a true MMORPG in about 11 years now, but when I did used to play, I remember those games would actively give you less and less XP from enemy kills if they detected you were staying in the same area farming kills for a lengthy period of time, and would also withhold loot rewards for the same reason. Other MMORPGs could do this in 2010, and yet New World can't pull off the same trick in 2020. 2022? As we'll get into later, it seems like the New World developers have mastered the art of making excuses about how they somehow can't easily incorporate features that the rest of the MMORPG industry have been incorporating for easily the past 10 or 15 years without any difficulty. I should note that if you can get into a dungeon, the boss fights are admittedly the sole saving grace of this mode. While not necessarily mind-blowing by any stretch of the imagination, they're serviceable enough. I think they could have done a bit more work on the boss AI to make it truly a challenge. While giving a boss a ton of health and a lot of damage output will obviously raise the stakes for the player slightly, that doesn't in of itself make them fun to play against. There's a reason why games like Dark Souls or Remnant from the Ashes generally get praised for their difficult but memorable boss fights. Conversely, I don't remember anyone really going out of their way to shower New World's bosses with praise, and I think a lot of the reason behind that is due to the expeditions, like most of the PvE systems, feeling very rushed, as if they were hastily thrown together at the last minute with the attitude of, we'll patch it up later. A lot of emphasis in New World is placed on gathering resources. You could even make a reasonable argument about how New World at its core is basically just a resource farming game, which isn't necessarily either a good or bad thing, but rather a bit of both. During the early portion of the game, during your typical level 1 through level 20 stage, most players will spend easily hours chopping down trees with a log axe, chipping away at rocks with a pickaxe, searching through crates in a typical enemy guarded chest, etc. Once you level up a bit, you can also add on top of that stuff like Corrupted Breaches, which is New World's single half-assed attempt at a world event, which will reward you with, you guessed it, yet more resources. And you see what I mean. There's a certain point where a busy work stops being mindless fun and instead just collectively becomes a pointless and arbitrary waste of time. Going back to the world event discussion point for a moment, I find it nothing short of baffling that New World, a game that pretty openly markets itself as being this revolutionary MMORPG light, which intended to keep most of the core functionality with one of the major differences between it and most MMORPGs being the comparatively limited max player count per server. But yet, it didn't include, and to date still hasn't included, world bosses or random world events that would require a larger number of players working together in order to emerge victorious, with the temporary collaboration being rewarded with fair rewards proportional to that player's contribution to the effort. This is a point I'll be revisiting later, but the lack of large-scale cooperative events to match those already present on the PvP side of the game is to the game's disadvantage. Just as PvP isn't only restricted to individual or small-scale group duels, but has a secondary, more organized PvP mode for guilds to utilize, it seems not only right, but rather necessary that PvE have similar support. Also, just regarding PvP, but I'm honestly confounded at the fact that PvP arenas are simply not a thing here, for whatever reason. At one point, the game flirts with the idea by sending you on a quest that brings you within sight of this tiny, rinky-dink arena location, within close distance of a fast travel point, but there's literally no reason to go there as it offers no unique advantage or special features, aside from allowing other players enough room to stand around and watch the two of you fight. It's not even a marked location on the map, as if the developers themselves are ashamed at how little effort was put into this, so they attempt to pretend it doesn't even exist to begin with, beyond the introductory quest. Not too long ago, I was playing Lost Ark, shortly after its full public launch. I was reasonably high-leveled at the time, as I already had a head start, being someone who backed the game prior to launch, and I was passing through one of the main towns in the game, arguably the main town, and there was a gladiatorial arena you could physically visit to both participate in one-on-one duels or team-based PvP combat, whatever. Alternatively, you could choose to spectate said combat, and the spectator system was actually quite decent, with multiple camera perspectives, the ability to move the camera around, zoom in and zoom out, and enable or disable certain aspects of the HUD. It wasn't a perfect system. I was mildly annoyed I couldn't see certain things in spectator mode, like what abilities were on cooldown for what player and for how long, but overall it was a competent enough system. Lost Ark isn't a Amazon developed game, but Amazon absolutely had a hand in it as the game's Western publisher. And Lost Ark has been readily available to play in South Korea for the past several years now, so it's not unreasonable to think that maybe Amazon could have taken some cues from them in terms of how to properly develop PvP arenas. Maybe one could argue that Amazon didn't want to further divide the player base by creating a PvP arena system dependent on matchmaking. That's fine, but it still doesn't explain why they couldn't have made more of an effort to integrate PvP arenas into the open world by simply placing at least a handful of them in some of the towns and settlements they already created. Again, to be absolutely clear, I don't personally have much of a horse in this race. I don't give a shit about PvP myself. I probably wouldn't make much use of any PvP arenas even if Amazon did introduce them to New World in some subsequent update, but I voiced my complaints here because I feel Amazon unfairly neglected many of New World's earliest fans, who in large part helped spread the word publicly and drum up widespread excitement for New World, who, with the implicit and explicit expectation that that New World would specifically be catering to players who want to enjoy a MMO light that specifically focused on PvP content, almost to the exclusion of all else. The New World that we ultimately got barely even resembled what was originally promised. Another of the most talked about set of features leading up to New World's launch, and still remains one of the centerpieces behind the game's design, is the player-driven economy as well as faction domination. Similar in some respects to the faction system seen in PlanetSide 2, for those of you old enough to remember PlanetSide 2 in its glory days, you have a number of independent factions which players can join and support, and struggle with the other factions to seize and maintain control over the many distinct regions that populate the map. New World, I believe, has 14 territories, although I do believe a couple of the endgame territories are forcibly neutral, as in they cannot be held by the various factions, and are just for PvE activities. But I believe you can still capture a dozen or so of the total available territories. Upon seizing dominion over a territory, the faction member who led the raid can determine the new tax laws of that region, having a direct effect over that region's economy. The in-game market is probably simultaneously one of the best and worst mechanics in New World. Amazon designed the market to wholeheartedly follow the Ayn Rand philosophy of anything goes capitalism to the extreme. Andrew Ryan from BioShock would probably likewise approve. Due to the uneven way the game rewards players with gold, mostly by fronting low-level players with a generous amount of gold at the conclusion of story quests, and to a lesser degree side quests as well, while conversely giving lesser amounts of gold for faction quests and other types of quests that higher level players will naturally favor. Due to the way the game's progression system is inherently designed, lower level players are incentivized to spend most if not all of their gold, to the point where once you get higher level, you don't have enough saved up over time to really keep unlocking stuff or buying stuff without doubling and tripling down on the grind in order to make the same amount that you otherwise easily made at a far lower level. Additionally, the incredibly low requirements for crafting stuff like health potions and food make recovery very cheap for players, which further incentivizes physical recklessness in players in addition to economic recklessness. I don't need or want New World to necessarily go all out in mimicking Dark Souls or now Elden Ring, but New World seemingly goes out of its way to either not punish or even arguably incentivize players to ignore defense in favor of just spamming away. The thing is, if that was the case, and the whole metagame was supposedly to revolve around quick alternating spamming of different abilities, why did the developers deliberately construct such a limited number of cooldown abilities? You only have 3 cooldown abilities per weapon, with a maximum of 2 equipable weapon slots, resulting in a max pool of 6 available abilities, which in total is a astoundingly small total ability pool for any MMO or MMO light. And the thing is, originally I believe the plan was to only allow 1 weapon at a time. Thank God they ditched that at the last minute before the public beta. However, now I actually would have preferred it if they eventually go to 3 weapons and continue adding at least a handful more weapon types for players to pick from. I'd love to run a setup where I have a long-range weapon, a close-range weapon, and a support weapon. That way if I want to do all 3 roles, damage, tanking, and support, all at once, I can, instead of only picking 2. Either make it so players are stuck with only 1 role, and you put a lot of unique talents into that 1 role, or allow the player to embrace all the roles at once. Again, Amazon's insistence on choosing a middle ground approach, not fully committing to one side or the other, works to New World's disadvantage. Just as a quick aside, the weapon animations for most of the available weapons are all technically passable, but they lack a certain visual flair. You don't really get an iconic sense of style that so often largely defines the combat system of any game, especially MMOs. Maybe the argument is that they wanted it to look and feel somewhat realistic, but that has 2 counter-arguments. One being the obvious one, being that what's the point of having a high fantasy setting while simultaneously pretending to be realistic? Secondly, you can still be realistic in a high fantasy setting while still having a certain otherness quality that allows you to inject a bit of style into whatever world you're in. Anyone who's ever seen a single scene of Game of Thrones can attest to this point. Even in gaming, we have games like 2018's God of War, which had a similar visual tone and yet had a very memorable and stylish combat system, in large part due to the excellent weapon and melee animations present throughout. You could say many things about God of War's combat system, you definitely couldn't say it was entirely realistic. While the weapons may lack a bit in terms of function and style, there is an impressive degree of variety in the stats of each weapon. As with most looter shooters and RPG games nowadays, your average weapon or armor piece has about half a dozen or so different attributes that provide active or passive buffs to your character, with players being actively rewarded for combining armor and weapons in a way that plays to their own instinctual playstyle. On my higher level account, I've been spending a lot of time lately using my hammer, so I reorganized my build to maximize my character's strength and vitality stats, basically turning my character into a in-game version of Reinhardt from Overwatch, even complete with my own hammer down cooldown ability. but previously I'd spent most of my time with my one-handed sword, in which case I had allocated most of my skill points and armor attributes towards my character's intelligence, increasing the damage of my thin blade at the expense of having a somewhat lower health, more vulnerable character. The game easily allows you to reset your skill points at will, so luckily you do have an unusual amount of flexibility, swapping between your preferred dominant role and something altogether different. That said, getting back to the economical side of it, weapon prices for most low and mid-level players will be ridiculously low. However, you'll notice once you get into the higher level stuff, you'll be coughing up quite a bit of money, going so far as the thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars. Buying a legendary quality sword, or hammer if you will, ultimately becomes not much cheaper than buying a house. Speaking of which, let's move on to the housing system, shall we? It's worth noting in the launch version of the game, I believe the max limits for taxation were up to 20% for player houses, and I believe up to 15% for trading and crafting taxes. In the case of houses, this was insane. Your starter house would cost you at least 5,000 gold, and for players that got the game day one, you were given a coupon for 50% off your first house, in which case you'd only pay 2,500 gold. However, every 5 days you'd have to pay taxes in order to continue having access to your house. The coupon would save you 50% off your first tax payment too, but beyond that you'd be paying full price, which would mean you'd be forced to cough up potentially up to 500 gold every 5 days. Which isn't an inconsiderable amount. For a scale comparison, that's basically half a day of grinding side quests and faction quests. Is it the end of the world? Absolutely not, but that's still not a small amount of money. And that's a tax payment on literally the smallest of houses. If you've got one of the bigger houses, like one of the bigger houses that will run you 20,000 gold, we're talking you needing to cough up about 4,000 gold every 5 days. Past a certain point, that's borderline impossible to attain on a consistent basis, unless you're spending almost every waking moment doing nothing but playing New World. Luckily, the developers seem to have recognized this and have subsequently spent the last few months trying to address this. Last November, they cut the minimum tax rate in half from 20% to 10%. And more recently in February of this year lowered it yet again from 10% to 1%, with the new minimum tax rate being only 0.1%. That's right, depending on your territory's tax rate under this new tax code, your $20,000 house will cost you between 20 and 200 gold now, which is a lot better. That said, there is another problem with the housing system that still remains, being that you're still unable to sell your house if you no longer want it. There is an option to abandon it, but there really isn't much incentive now to actually do that, given how expensive houses can be. And with the added inability to sell your existing house and put that money towards your new house, it really makes me question the developers' commitment to addressing the issues surrounding player housing in this game. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that the developers have to create a whole housing market ecosystem with inflation factors and all that, but if they can just add a simple button to make tax payments, I'm pretty sure they can slap together a similar button that allows you to, say, get between 30 and 50% back, depending on how long you've owned the house. Since you probably don't want to encourage players constantly buying and dumping houses, because you want to reinforce the idea that houses have some substantial value, maybe make it so if a player sells a house within 30 days of buying it, they only get 30% back, and if they've owned it for 45 days, the number increases to 40% back, and if they've held on to it for the full 60 days or so, they get 50% back. I'm scaling this all by 60 days in accordance with how New World allows you to change factions, which is an example of an existing mechanic that has a real-world timed component. Once you buy a house, you're going to want to customize it, right? You spent all that money on it, why not tweak it exactly to your liking? Well, the truth is you can't really do that. The number of cosmetic house decorations available is incredibly limited. For a feature that the developers made a big deal about both at launch and during the lead-up to launch, and even since launch, it ended up being a massive disappointment. My expectations weren't exactly insanely high either. I wasn't expecting a customization system anywhere as extensive as, say, The Sims, but I was definitely hoping for more than what we got. As far as I can tell, the doors, stairs, and railings all appear to be completely unmodifiable. For the houses that have a backyard, there aren't really a lot of items that specifically are made for that kind of area. There's also barely any variety in terms of the items you can equip in the house itself, like bookshelves, tables, chairs, etc. Again, I feel like this was another missed opportunity for adding yet more for the player to do, ranging from simple stuff, like maybe have a few unique animations, like the player taking a book from the bookshelf and sitting down to read, or for those of you that have pets as decorations, allow players to pet the dog or whatever animal you've got, and allow them to wander around the house freely instead of just being as they are, where they just remain completely stationary, aside from doing a basic breathing animation loop. Additionally, maybe the player could learn how to cook some specific delicate meals that wouldn't makes sense to prepare it on the go in a normal outdoor camp. And maybe you make it so the house gets dirtier and grimier over time, requiring the player to clean it up every now and then. You can have a housekeeping skill similar to the cooking skills you've already got. Keeping your house well clean could result in you gaining additional passive bonuses, but maybe if your house is extremely neglected, you risk having to pay additional housekeeping tax to the faction running your town. Or you could add something different altogether. The point is that if you're going to have house ownership be a specifically cosmetic endeavor, just for those that want to have a bit of fun with additional roleplay, that's fine, have at it. But the game fails in that regard by providing only a very limited number of cosmetic decorations and home customization tools for the player to utilize. On the flip side, if the houses were never meant to be specifically cosmetic or roleplay focused, but merely serving as an additional fast travel point, then that's made almost completely redundant now for a reason I'll be getting into in a minute. The only other third option being that maybe houses are only good for the minor passive buffs that they grant the player, except that these buffs are so insignificant that they'd need a decent buff in order to justify spending thousands of gold, if not tens of thousands, just in order to unlock them. Any way you slice it, New World's houses are a total misfire. Getting back to that second point about fast travel though, another area the game has improved drastically, ironically in the same February patch mentioned earlier, was in terms of fast travel cost. For those of you that probably haven't seen my initial New World First Impressions video way back when they were still running the open beta for the game, ahead of the full launch, this was probably one of the biggest areas of criticism for me. The traversal options in this game at launch were, and to some degree still remain, completely dogshit. You basically have one of two options. Either you manually slowly saunter back to town doing the world's most unconvincing sprint, or you teleport back. Admittedly, the developers have made the smallest of improvements to manual traversal by making the roads actually more than just mere decoration, and instead giving a 10% movement speed buff for however long the player remains on said road. The problem is that this movement buff is so slow that most players, including myself, didn't even notice it had been added until we checked the patch notes. And even now when I'm looking at it, it's hard to tell when my characters even initiated this speed boost. They've got to boost it a bit more to maybe 20% in order for it to have any long-term benefit to players. In almost all cases, it's far preferable to just teleport as opposed to sprinting. You can either teleport back at the end at whatever town you last visited, which had a hour-long cooldown, or you run over to a fast travel point and pay using in-game currency to fast travel to whatever town you wanted to visit. The problem was that the costs for using this alternate method were insanely high. You could find yourself using up anywhere from 50 to 500 mana. To be honest, I forget what this blue potion looking currency is called, and nor does it really matter. I'm just calling it mana. Just know that it takes a hell of a long time to manually collect while doing random stuff, or alternatively costs a lot to purchase with in-game gold in the player market. Players would end up spending the overwhelming portion of their time in-game running back and forth in a straight line from the town to their quest and then back to the town from their quest. Despite the massive amount of player demand during the beta and subsequent full launch, the developers have remained bullheadedly opposed to the outcry for rideable mounts for players, or even NPC-provided group transport like wagons. The developers even went out of their way at launch to openly mock a portion of the player base who had begun setting up petitions for player mounts, and reaffirmed their opposition by claiming that if players had mounts, they would never be able to fully appreciate the undeniable beauty quality of New World's constantly alive open world design. For comparison's sake, World of Warcraft has existed for, 20 years now? And has had rideable mounts for literally 19 of those 20 years. And World of Warcraft basically single-handedly revolutionized the MMORPG industry, in large part through its incredibly high-budget graphics, iconic world design, and extensively intricate multiplayer social features. I'm by no means a fan of World of Warcraft. I tried it once and found it unbelievably unappealing, but you'd be denying hard, concrete fact if you don't recognize how it changed an entire industry, even on day one. New World, meanwhile, the game was borderline unplayable for most of the entire first month it was online. Constant texture issues where whole portions of the map would show up as untextured, horrible degrees of pop-in, non-stop stuttering, server lag, etc. And even if you take all that away, the overwhelming majority of the map looks like a bunch of Unreal Engine 4 stock assets lazily slapped together with a decent lighting system. That's one area where the game absolutely looks fine. The lighting and weather effects certainly do the game credit, but the idea that rideable mounts were dismissed simply because the territories themselves were too beautiful or whatever for players to overlook is complete and utter bullshit. If these territories actually were all that beautiful and whatever, you wouldn't need to find yourself in this position of trying to convince players that they don't need mounts, because players would be too preoccupied enjoying your beautiful world. There are many descriptive adjectives I would use to describe the models, props, and textures that populate New World's territories. Beautiful would never be one of them. You might be wondering why complain about this now. Well, because it turns out that not only deciding to not listen to your players, but on top of that, telling players to go fuck themselves, can bring with it some damn meaningful consequences. The active player base has more or less fallen off a cliff. In September of last year, within the game's first full launch month, New World had an average concurrent player base of nearly 1 million active players, making it, at the time, one of the most played games on Steam. Last month, February 2022, it had a grand total of just over 32,000 average concurrent players, meaning in that month, New World had only retained less than 4% of its peak concurrent player base just 6 months prior. We haven't quite reached the same level of failure as, say, Marvel's Avengers, but there's no denying Amazon should be nothing short of embarrassed at New World's blunders. And we should recognize at this point that no amount of bug fixes will save this sinking ship of a game at this rate. If it was me in the room being tasked with salvaging what's left of this game from the ruined state it's currently in, my first move would be to halt any development of future content until the core systems are reworked. I would rework the entire questing system from the ground up. I would go for the more Destiny 2 direction by introducing more cutscenes and enable voiceover narration for the majority, if not all, existing collectible lore notes, expand all existing voice work so NPCs say their full lines, not just the first sentence. I would rework the combat system to reward synergy between player abilities, rather than this current just spam away individually approach. I would rework the AI to make even smaller enemies feel more interesting to fight against. I would add way more variety to what kinds of faction quests you can get. I would make towns feel more alive by adding more social events and minigames for communities to bond over, like maybe some official in-game dice or card games, or in-person auction houses, or maybe special limited time events that occur only in certain existing towns. This last one the developers already kind of experimented with via the Winter Festival event earlier this year, but I'd prefer it if they have more regular small in-game events on a daily basis, similar to the daily PvP raids or the PvE invasion events, both of which occur a scheduled time every day. You could do something similar for towns. Another game I occasionally played, Tower Unite, has done this very well. Similar in design to Second Life, Tower Unite has a more small-scale social hub game. And every 10 minutes or so, there's a special social activity players can do together, usually coming in the form of a quick minigame. You get a certain amount of in-game currency for participating. New World would definitely benefit from this. I would also open up the queuing system for expeditions, transforming it into a single universal matchmaking system where anyone from that region, say any players on US West Coast or any players on US East Coast, can get placed into the same group. I have no problem with the developers encouraging pre-made groups to be a thing, but as with the whole writable mounts problem, they don't just limit themselves to encouraging one particular playstyle, they actively stamp out any opportunity to play the game in any other way other than the one they dictate. Not dissimilar to what we see in certain indie games, like, for example, Yandere Simulator. The developers have a very toxic attitude towards anyone who does not share the same playstyle or gameplay values that they do. The developers marketed New World as a game you can play your own way, but the problem is nothing in the actual game does anything to support that liberty, and in fact openly flies in the face of that ideal. Lastly, and this is probably the most obvious and necessary change, drop the paid $50 model and make this game free to play already. While going free to play in of itself will not be the ultimate fix, if the developers begin really reworking this game in a similar manner to what I outlined, or otherwise make great efforts to fix the current course, and then relaunch the game as a free-to-play title with an increased focus on both paid cosmetics and maybe expansions, then we'd probably see some kind of positive turnaround in this game's future. It may not necessarily be a return to the game's golden age of basically 1 million concurrent players, but if the game leveled out with a consistent 500k concurrent player base rate, that wouldn't be anything to sneer at either. Overall, I'm really torn as to whether or not I can honestly recommend this game. By all the available measurable metrics, New World is a functionally competent, albeit fairly mediocre, new entry that nevertheless is certainly a welcome sight in the currently stale traditional MMORPG market. And while almost every single mechanic and component in New World is inherently rushed, poorly executed, and forgettable, I still believe there is a lot of potential in New World if Amazon continues to stand by this game and commit to putting out far more new, consistent content updates on top of their bug fixes and optimizational improvements. So far, though, the inconsistency of developer communication from Amazon regarding New World's future does strike me as one of the ultimate points of concern moving forward. I'm willing to forgive Amazon mostly for the rough and unfinished state New World was in on day one. Is it ideal? Absolutely not. Do I think in general that it's acceptable for a AAA produced game to require even a single day one patch in order to function properly, let alone a series of patches of decreasing size, as the developers desperately try to plug the many holes that's become apparent? Obviously, games in such a poor state at launch deserve criticism. But if we're going to criticize Amazon or any other game publisher for their failures at launch, we have to at least give them some partial credit for standing by the game post-launch. That said, I think the best move for Amazon right now, leading up to the 1-year anniversary of this game this coming fall, would be to overhaul the game in active preparation to relaunch it as a free-to-play game, alongside a massive 2.0 update. Show those who doubted the game that not only were you confident in the game on day one, you're confident that you can win back their trust and loyalty, and expand your reach to hopefully a massive influx of new players that can help restore the population of each server and provide overall stability across the game, while the more hardcore players continue to support the game through additional in-game monetization in lieu of the normal retail price. To directly address the title of this video, is New World worth buying? It depends. It depends on what you expect from it. Is it a good solo experience? It kind of is until it's not. Is it a good co-op experience? Same answer. It's okay until it's not. And while really not that motivated to engage in PvP here in New World, the limited amount of experience I've had with it leads to mostly agree with the majority of players in saying again, it's okay until it's not. Where it really gets bleak is when you've gotten to the higher level sections of the map where hardly any of the player base have either made it that far, or those that have already abandoned the game. In many of those areas, the game honestly feels a bit like a ghost town. It's incredibly easy to find yourself getting fed up with New World, and I don't blame those that have. If you're on the fence about whether or not you should buy it, I highly recommend you go watch some lengthy Twitch live streams of the actual gameplay. Don't just watch edited reviews like mine or Let's Play videos here on YouTube. Find yourself some actual raw, as Gordon Ramsay would say, fucking raw playthroughs to watch at length, because I promise you, if you're looking for this super exciting MMO with lots of action and tense moments, you will more than likely find yourself disappointed the majority of the time. Setting aside the PvP raids available as endgame content for high-level players, New World is a far more casual-oriented MMORPG than you might initially assume. If that's your thing, then great, but if not, that's something to keep in mind. Whether New World retains any long-term longevity depends greatly on whether Amazon is willing to commit to more substantial major updates and expansions over time. If within the next few months, say sometime in Q2 or Q3 2022, we get to the point where Amazon puts out at least 2 or 3 major updates a year, introducing more content and significantly reworking the questing system and a number of other areas where the game currently is definitely lacking, that would go a long way, I think, towards making New World the game it should have and probably would have been all along if it weren't for the very turbulent development process it underwent, even during the months leading up to release. And on that note, that's where I think I'm going to wrap it up for today. As ever, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to click the like button and comment below what you think of the game. Likewise, subscribing and clicking the bell really helps. I know it's cliche, but the YouTube algorithm, once again, is a pain in the ass to deal with, doubly so if you're a small channel like me. This is Warrior Dan signing out. Stay awesome, everybody. Stay safe, and peace out.